Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the Humanities Student Talks number 18. My name is Victoria and I am the Student Projects Coordinator here at Polygence, and I'm so excited to be moderating and judging today's panel. We have a full roster prepared for you today with 3 amazing student presentations about a variety of different topics. We will be having a Q&A session after each presentation. So please, if you have a question for one of the students here, please type it into the Q&A bar on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will allot between 3 to 5 minutes per presentation for questions. So first up, we have Allison Lowe, who is a senior from Pleasant Hill, California. And I will invite Allison to share her screen at the moment.
Hi. It's not letting me share my, oh wait, I think I got it. Okay. Can you guys see my screen okay? Sorry. Sorry, my thing is kind of, sorry, could I maybe, half a minute?
Sure, no problem.
Okay.
For the other presenters, just as we're preparing for your presentation, as I mentioned, please make sure to have your presentation up in a separate tab and ready to go so that you can screen share and everyth's all set. But while we wait for Allie, we'll just give her another few moments to make sure everything is all ready to go.
Okay, I think I've got it now. Can you see my screen okay? Okay, so hi, my name is Allison Lowe, and this is The Changing Ideals of War as Reflected Through British Poetry of the First World War. In much of the literature surrounding war, from the ancient times through the modern era, war was often viewed as heroic and necessary for a great society to thrive. Many ancient societies had gods dedicated to war, such as Ares of the Greeks and Mars of the Romans, who were offered plentiful prayers and sacrifices. In mythology, war was, in many ways, depicted as an integral component of humanity. In fact, the Mesopotamian god Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, was said to have used the blood of a favored warrior in order to create humans. As such, war dominates much of the literature written in ancient times. From Homer to Virgil to the stories of the Bible, stories of war were constantly being retold and reflected upon.
Hi, Allie. I don't mean to interrupt, but we can't see your screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I have a really bad laptop. Okay. Okay. I can just, can you see it now?
Yes, all good.
Okay, I'll just continue now. I'm so sorry. As they went through their schooling, the British students who would soon become soldiers in the First World War were being taught many of these ancient and religious texts. Texts from the classical era in particular were taught heavily. For example, the syllabus for the classical school at Marlborough College shows that a boy who graduated in 1914 would have read texts from 15 classical writers, including Homer, Virgil, Ovid, and Caesar. When war was described by these writers, it was often depicted as a heroic and glorious effort, thus impacting how boys going through the British school system developed their perceptions of war. As F.E. Harrison states in Homer and the Poetry of War, war was seen as something that brought men glory. Thus, in the lead-up to the fighting of the First World War, many of the British soldiers looked back to the classical texts they had read in order to form their expectations of what war would be like. In 1914, war broke out. While war is never an exciting prospect, many viewed fighting in this war as an opportunity to defend England against its enemies. Much of the soldier-written poetry that was sent home to be read in newspapers and anthologies during this time reflected an optimistic and patriotic view of the war. In November 1914, Harold Begbie's recruiting poem, Fall In, was published across England. It read, "Where will you look, sonny, where will you look? When your children yet to be, clamor to learn the part you took in the war that kept men free." The poem continues on to chronicle the inevitable lifetime of regret that will follow any eligible man who declines to fight in this great war, thus being exemplary of many early war poems, which emphasize the heroism and sacrifice that came along with fighting for one's nation. Also in 1914, the collection Songs and Sonnets for England in Wartime was published, which was an anthology of poems that had recently been published in newspapers. Throughout the anthology, many of the poems published here utilized language and imagery garnered toward arousing a nation for war, with plentiful mentions of kings, knights, and glory. While several poems bemoan the violence and bloodshed of the war, the majority retain a strong sense of duty and patriotism. As the war dragged on and more casualties amassed, the war poets took on a more somber tone, meditating on ideas such as the tragedy and futility of war. In 1915, poison gas was utilized by German specialist troops for the first time, a tool which would soon cause the painful deaths for many soldiers. In 1916, the Battle of the Somme became one of the bloodiest battles in history, with over 1 million casualties, 420,000 of which were suffered by British troops. To nearly all soldiers, this war was no longer a glorious and noble event. It had become something much more. Whereas one poet in 1914 might write about the glory of dying for England, another in 1916 might write about what a senseless tragedy it was to die in a seemingly unending war. One of the principal ways to see this change in perception is through looking at the poetic analysis of a war poem written in 1914 versus one written in 1916. For this example, I will be comparing Rupert Brooke's 1914 poem, The Soldier, with Siegfried Sassoon's 1916 poem, The Deathbed. Brooke's The Soldier reads, "If I should die, think only this of me. There's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Brooke's poem illustrates the idea that not only was dying at war a glorious death, but that it was also beneficial to oneself and one's people to die in a war that would aid the nation. Throughout the rest of the poem, Brooke carries a patriotic and uplifting tone, writing the soldiers as being at peace with dying for England. This sort of death is presented as a heroic event rather than a tragic one. This demonstrates the faith that many had regarding war as a whole at the beginning of the war. It was more or less believed that a war would right wrongs and produce glory for England and its allies. Siegfried Sassoon's 1916 poem, The Deathbed, offers a stark contrast to Brooke. Sassoon writes, "He stirred, shifting his body. Then the pain leaped like a prowling beast and gripped and tore his groping dreams with grinding claws and fangs." This poignant simile reflects the harsh reality of war, that dying in battle, even when fighting for one's nation, was not glorious. It was painful and horrendous. Additionally, Brooke and Sassoon utilize incredibly different poetic devices. The line breaks in The Soldier are largely unintrusive, rarely interrupting a thought and only occurring in natural grammatical breaks. Sassoon's lines, meanwhile, are oftentimes fractured, representing the more tortured and fragmented perspective of the later years of the war. Additionally, Brooke has a far more structured approach to rhyme scheme than Sassoon, with the entirety of the first stanza of The Soldier employing an A-B rhyme pattern. Contrastingly, The Deathbed has no clear rhyme scheme, as the majority of the lines do not have any rhyme with one another at all. Having witnessed 2 years of unimaginable horrors, Sassoon likely saw no poetic sense in imposing a strict structure upon a poem that described a phenomenon that appeared to have no sense or structure at all. As early poems from the war demonstrate, many of these soldiers headed off towards the battlefields with a sense of optimism and naivety. For their entire lives, they'd been indoctrinated with certain cultural values, thus being made to believe that the fate of fighting and even dying in a war was to be desired. However, as the war dragged on, these soldiers were forced to abandon their ideals and grapple with their own grim realities. In the face of a war that seemed unlistening and unending, many of these soldiers turned to poetry as a means through which to disparage the wartime values with which they had been raised. The poets of World War I not only forever altered the way that war was represented in literature, but also the art of literature as a whole, making a profound impact on readers and writers for generations to come. Indeed, the reverberations of the First World War can be found in much of the poetic work from following wars. Following the lead of their predecessors, wartime poets no longer choose to write of the idyllic glories and sacrifices of war. Instead, like Siegfried Sassoon, their pens reflect the agony that the human spirit endures when faced with such an abundance of death and destruction. Today, as the United States pulls out of a 20-year-long war in Afghanistan and conflicts continue to cause destruction across the globe, war remains just as relevant as it was in 1917. In Afghani German poet Arya Auber's 2021 poem, Notes from the Ruined City, she writes, "Before you left me, we held each other in the American hotel overlooking this landlocked relief, our bodies exuding summer, a halo of insects lighting up the balcony. Amid the ruin of the neighboring roof, one could see 2 children asleep, like children, on the white wood of a dismantled door." Similar to the poets of World War I, Auber takes care to invoke her poem with a sense of the tragedy that war imposes on the human spirit. In describing that the children sleep like children, she also shies away from creating a metaphor out of a situation that should not need to be made poetic in order to be important or valued. Poetic elements such as these being seen within a war poem would have been unthought of just over a century ago. Indeed, they are far removed from the ideals of glory, heroism, and sacrifice that had once dominated war poetry. Due to the many poetic contributions of the British poets of the First World War, the ways in which we express war in literature have been forever changed. Thank you, and I just want to say a special thank you to my mentor, Chelsea, who helped me create this project.
Wonderful, Allie. Well, thank you so much. That presentation was so enlightening. Well, we did have a few questions for you. So just a quick plug as we're going through Q&A. Please ask a question in our Q&A panel for any of our presenters today. And so, Allie, I'm going to ask you the first question. Did this shift in attitude towards the war mainly occur in Europe or elsewhere as well?
Well, since World War I took place in Europe, I mainly just studied the shift in attitude in Europe and especially in Great Britain in the poetry I used, but I think that it was a worldwide change just as war became more violent due to technology changing and evolving.
Very interesting. And so on the same topic of how this changed war poetry overall, how did this change in attitude affect wartime poetry in World War II? And was it similarly positive at the beginning of the war, or was it still quite sad and negative?
I think overall it became more negative and anti-war after World War I, as more poets kind of had this reference to look back on what war was actually like instead of only looking at idealized versions that they'd maybe learned in school or from stories and stuff like that. So I think World War II is definitely more realistic towards the beginning.
Interesting. And what was your personal favorite text from your research?
So I really liked the poem I used of Sassoon's The Deathbed, just because I think the imagery is so evocative. I only included a little bit. It's a little long, but you can definitely go and read the rest online. And yeah, there are a lot of interesting research papers I read. Stand in the Trench Achilles, which is a research book on how classical texts influenced war poets during the First World War, which is also really interesting.
Fascinating. Well, thank you, Allie, for that wonderful presentation. I am now going to usher up our second presenter today, Grace Wang, who is a freshman from Bellevue, Washington.
So I'm a junior now.
Oh, junior. Oh, my apologies. Well, thank you for presenting. We're so excited to hear what you have to present.
Does it look okay? right now. Oops, this is not wrong. Okay. Can you see it? Okay, cool. So hi, my name is Grace, and I did my research project on the trial of Maurice Papon. So in choosing a topic, I didn't really know what I wanted to study, but I was taking French at the time, and I also had an interest in history. So I thought, why not study French history? So my mentor Elizabeth and we first went through France's World War II past, and then we went, the German occupation of France from 1940 to 1944, and then we went through France's colonial history, so more specifically the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. And as we studied the German occupation and also some of this colonial history, I became particularly interested in how France remembered these pasts. And notably, the research raised a question such as, how do countries reckon with their past crimes? And as attitudes towards the past change, how should a country redress these crimes? And in researching, Elizabeth and I found this figure, Maurice Papon, who was a French civil servant who assisted in the deportation of over 1,000 Jews as a bureaucrat when France was under German occupation during the Second World War. But he was also responsible for the brutal massacre of young Algerians who were protesting a discriminatory curfew during the Algerian War of Independence. But only in 1997 would he finally go on trial for his crimes, in what would be the longest trial in French history. So I wanted to find out, why his trial was so long and so vexed. And I found that his trial had enormous symbolic significance. And I argue that while it was important to French remembrance of the Holocaust, the trial took place 50 years after the Second World War. This demonstrates a reluctance on behalf of the French state to account for its wartime crimes. And in close reading, the trial seems to use Papon as symbolic of the regime as a whole. In essence, punish him and the nation gets to move on. Moreover, the trial made it explicit that the only crime he was on trial for were the deportations and not the massacre. And we might infer from this that France is also reluctant to address its crimes committed not simply during the Algerian War of Independence, but the crimes committed in the name of imperial power more broadly. So a quick at a glance. First, I'll be going through some background information, and then I'll explain why I think Papon's trial was lacking in so many ways. First, let's go into his World War II past, where he was the Secretary General in the city of Bordeaux. And it was in this role that he was later accused of participating in the deportation of over 1,000 Jews. So the German occupation of France is more commonly referred to Vichy France, or just Vichy for short. So following the German invasion of France in World War II, there was an armistice signed dividing France into the occupied North and the unoccupied South. And during this time, over 75,000 Jews would be deported. And this raised the debate of, exactly how much responsibility did France have for these deportations, and how much was due to it being a so-called puppet state. However, France undoubtedly had a role in the Nazi plan, was as shown by these two key events during the regime. So firstly, there was the Veldiv Roundup of 1942, which was the largest mass roundup in Vichy France, where Jewish men, women, and children were confined in the Vélodrome d'Hiver in Paris, but they were done so by French police before being deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. In short, the Veldiv Roundup shows the irrefutable role of France in the Holocaust. Secondly, there was the legal purge of 1944. So following the liberation of Paris and the fall of Vichy, over 40,000 people were sentenced for collaborating with the Germans. But they weren't tried for crimes against humanity, which wasn't a part of French law. They were tried for treason. And that's how people like René Bousquet, who's shown in this picture, he masterminded the Veldiv Roundup, and yet he was only given the minimum punishment of national degradation. And this was even later lifted due to claimed services to the resistance. In short, the legal purge failed to take responsibility for the French role in the Holocaust. In 1995, so 53 years after the Veldiv Roundup, Former President Jacques Chirac would become the first French president to publicly acknowledge this role in the Holocaust, saying, yes, it is true that the criminal insanity of the occupying forces was supported by some French people and the French state. So this provides some context for Papon's trial in that it takes place in a France that is finally ready to reckon with its wartime crimes. And with that, in 1997, Papon would become the first Vichy bureaucrat to go on trial for crimes against humanity. So this is just a very brief rundown of Papon's trial, and we kind of get to see the debate over responsibility sort of play out a bit here. So the prosecution said that he had responsibility as an essential cog in the Vichy system and thus the Nazi plan, whereas the defense said no, he was just a bureaucrat who had little power to change things given his lower rank in Vichy. And the results were a mixed bag, so he was charged with complicity in crimes against humanity rather than just crimes against humanity, and he was only sentenced to 10 years in prison, and he only served 3 due to failing health. And naturally, it came with complaints that his sentence was too lenient, and already we start to see the faults of placing the symbolic burdens of an entire regime on a single figure. So what happened in this huge gap between the deportations and Papon's trial? Well, turns out Papon had an extremely decorated career in politics, even being appointed prefect of police in Paris in 1958. And it was in this role that he would be responsible for the October 17th massacre in 1961. So Algeria was the crown jewel of the French Empire, so when there were stirrings of independence in the region, there was a vicious war fought to maintain the colony. And this conflict was also fought in the mainland, such as when Algerians protesting in Paris were met with excessive police brutality, where numerous witnesses recalled excessive gunfire and asserted that they saw police throwing bodies into the Seine. And this was initially mentioned in Papon's trial, but it was later dropped to focus on his Vichy crimes. And unlike Vichy, the past regarding the Algerian War of Independence has largely been silenced until very recently. So immediately following the Algerian War, President de Gaulle would issue an amnesty effectively pardoning all French military personnel for any war crime committed during the conflict. And the massacre was similarly covered up, and that's how Papon only got away with 3 official deaths, including one of which he attributed to cardiac arrest. Later estimates would place the death count at around 200. And with this information, I argue that Papon's trial was unsuccessful because it was neither able to holistically punish Papon nor to memorialize French pasts. So firstly, Papon was the first Vichy bureaucrat to go on trial for crimes against humanity when France was ready to reckon with her wartime past. This placed emphasis on the individual rather than state structures. Secondly, the trial happened 50 years after the crime, so after Papon enjoyed a long, fruitful career in politics. And this, combined with the trial's symbolic value, made it in many respects seem too little, too late. And obviously, Papon committed crimes outside of Vichy as well, and in this sense, trying him as a symbol for one past omitted another. And I argue that this follows a pattern of censorship and concealment regarding French colonial legacy. Today, France is still struggling with its colonial past. For example, in 2012, so just 9 years ago, former President François Hollande would become the first French president to publicly acknowledge the massacre of October 17, 1961. Coincidentally, both this and Chirac's acknowledgement in 1995 would occur a stunning 50 years, so half a century after the crime itself. And in this sense, Papon's trial in context shows how remembering the darker parts of the Algerian War of Independence remains a key struggle in France. And this is a part of an ongoing global process of reckoning with colonial legacy. And as we continue to discover and rediscover pasts, Papon's trial serves as a reminder of when one past is remembered, others may be left in the dark. Thank you for listening. So special thanks to my mentor, Elizabeth, who was a huge help and inspiration throughout the project. So it was really eye-opening to learn not only about French history, but a lot of analytical skills, so primary sources and like really dense texts. And above all, it's really helped to shape my worldview and get me to recognize all that I don't know. Here are some further resources and readings if anyone's interested in Vichy, the Algerian War, or just Veldiv, October 17th, or just Papon himself. And here are my works cited and images cited.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grace, so much for that fascinating analysis of this trial. So we do have a couple of questions for you. And again, if anyone has any last minute questions, please feel free to post in the Q&A. So Grace, first question for you. You mentioned that Papon committed other crimes outside of Vichy. Can you explain a little bit more what he did in between his time in the Vichy government and when he was put on trial?
So obviously, he was appointed the head of police in Paris, where he was responsible for the massacre. But he was also was appointed official, like as an official in like areas of North Africa as well. So in Algeria, briefly in Morocco. And some sources say that he was also responsible for some of the French use of torture in Algeria early on in the war when he was an official in that region. Yeah.
Wow. And of course, this 50-year gap in between World War II and when he was put on trial says something about France's reconciliation of their part in World War II. And so why do you think, in your opinion, the German response to their role in World War II was so different from France's?
Well, personally, I think that this has a lot to do with, the responsibility debate. Since France was seen also as a puppet state, this could be, easily, more easily hidden and more easily debated. Whereas the German response, because, Hitler and the Nazi plan were so, I don't want to say obviously, but for lack of a better word, obviously there, they couldn't really like hide from it in the same sense that France did.
Got it. And I'm going to ask a repeat question from Allie's presentation. I see you read a lot of primary sources, and so what one was your favorite?
Oh, okay. There were a lot. I think my favorite was probably the Battle of Algiers. So this was a film that was released like very recently after the Algerian War of Independence, so just like a few years. And it was kind of like a pseudo documentary film. And it was black and white, and it was just super interesting the way that they handled the subject matter. And a lot of like the actors and then the producers were also like actually a part of the war. So it was really interesting to see how that played in. And also watching that with my dad, who also like had an interest, that was really fun too. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. That's so great. Well, thank you, Grace, for sharing. And next up, last but certainly not least, we have Geetika Mahajan, who is a senior from Fremont, California.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you? We're so excited for your presentation. I'm going to take myself off and let you share your screen.
Okay. Okay, are you guys able to see it? No? Okay, hold on 1 second. How about now? Not yet. Okay, because I shared it with I like opened it in another tab and I shared it, so I'm not sure why it's not working. I can try doing it with the same tab. Okay. Okay, so this is my presentation. I hope you're having a great day, and it's basically going to be a breakdown of how art and literature were interconnected to the revolutionary ideology of the Arab Spring that caught the whole world's attention in the early 2010s. And it's also going to be expanding on how art and literature can become the epicenter of a revolution overall. Okay, so a few questions. What does art have to do with politics? What does Taylor Swift have to do with this presentation? Well, art and politics have been intertwined for hundreds of years. Michelangelo used his sculptures to articulate his own belief of the interconnectedness of religion and politics and citizenship. And in the modern day, we have artists like Taylor Swift using their music to articulate their own political beliefs as well. This photo is from the You Need to Calm Down music video in which she advocates for LGBTQ rights, for instance. The question then is not whether art has a connection with politics, but how they manage to influence politics overall. We will be looking at the Arab Spring and specifically Egypt and Syria to observe this phenomena and answer this question. Okay, so why are we looking at Egypt and Syria in particular? The Egyptian and Syrian revolutions are two instances in which revolutionaries have not yet succeeded in achieving their end goals. For Egypt,
apologies, Geetika. I don't mean to interrupt, but your screen is paused on your first slide, and we haven't seen when you've changed your slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this happened to someone else in like a presentation that I was in as well.
No worries. You might just have to try sharing your screen again.
Okay. Okay, so you can see this, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
If you click present, now we can see your first page.
Okay.
And should be all good.
Okay, so I just switched to another slide. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, this was my second slide. This is the picture that I was referring to. Yeah. But now we're on this one. So can you see the image of the protesters? Can you see the third slide?
Yep.
Okay.
All good.
Okay, awesome. So as I was saying, the Egyptian and Syrian revolutions are two instances in which the revolutionaries have not yet succeeded in achieving their end goals. And for Egypt, this means that despite two new presidents stepping in after Hosni Mubarak, who was in control from 1981 to 2011, the government still remains a military dictatorship, which is what the protesters were trying to end. Meanwhile, the Syrian people have not yet seen the resignation of their president Bashar al-Assad that they were protesting in the first place. So today we will be observing how art can benefit the revolutionaries and how it interacts on the local sphere, as well as how it's received on a local and international space. On a local level, this art has two functions, to heal and to satirize. We will first be looking at how revolutionary art can serve as a vehicle for healing and trauma. So the two novels we will be looking at to discuss this are That Smell by Sonali Ibrahim, published in 1996, which uses unembellished and crude narration to describe a former political prisoner's inability to interact with the external world due to the internal conflicts and PTSD that stem from his time in prison. Meanwhile, the second one, called The Frightened Ones, written by Dima Wanous, which is pictured here, is rife with emotion, specifically fear, as the author describes the crippling fear that can arise after living in an oppressive government. Both novels can be seen as an attempt for the authors to heal themselves and process their own trauma, as they both experiences similar to those characters in their novels. As we know, art therapy is pretty common as a healing method for those who have undergone traumatic experiences. However, it can also be so healing for the reader as well. There's something kind of beautiful almost in bringing this kind of trauma to light, however twisted it may seem initially. For instance, That Smell was heavily criticized and even banned when it was first released due to its aforementioned crudeness. However, it has grown to be recognized as a seminal piece of literature for its honest portrayal of trauma. The act of bringing such a painful experience to light, to allow people to recognize their own pain within these characters and to be able to see that they're not alone, is an immensely cathartic experience. Now, the next way that art interacts with the revolutionaries themselves is by satirizing the events of a revolution. This image is a still from the YouTube channel Masasit Mati. Using clownish clay figures to depict their leader Bashar al-Assad and his advisors, the short play portrays the Syrian dictator as a cowardly child, screaming from nightmares that he will be overthrown. His advisors are shown to be pacifying liars who convince him that nothing is wrong with his regime and he's in no danger of being overthrown. Now, from Jonathan Swift to John Oliver, satires have been a tongue-in-cheek method for criticizing the status quo. However, with something as tragic as the Arab Spring, it becomes even more than that. It becomes a tool for the revolutionaries of quiet resistance by turning their oppressors, who have for so long used fear to command respect and obedience within citizens, into laughable cartoons or caricatures. These regimes themselves feel more breakable. The creators of these videos possess the ability to see these imposing figures and turn them into an item of entertainment. They're able to face the horrors that such regimes throw at revolutionaries and innocent civilians and still have the courage and lightheartedness to create something humorous. This is an act of bravery and rebellion within itself, as well as a source of inspiration for other revolutionaries. After all, no one can be that intimidated after watching a video of the tyrannical president of Syria crying like a child over his nightmares. On the other hand, satirical art can also be kind of maudlin. The Q, a 2016 novel by Egyptian author Basma Abdel Aziz, is on the other side of the spectrum. I'll try not to spoil it too much because it's a really fascinating read if you want to go ahead and read that. But the novel makes the use of symbolism and allows the reader to make their own connections between the events taking place in the novel and the Egyptian revolution and what came after it. Specifically, Abdel Aziz's portrayal of the main character's almost Sisyphean journeys in the face of an autocratic government is a direct parallel to the progression of the Egyptian people's attempts to instill a democratic government of their own. This is something that would be easy for a local reader to understand, but might not be as well received on an international level. This is important because in the making of this parallel, Abdel Aziz is alluding to the impossibility of their task in the first place. And in that, she's almost caustically forgiving towards the rebels and preserving their hope and their mistakes for the future generations to learn from. Now, in the international community, art serves to provide a more pedagogical function. It seeks to maximize the audience and bring attention to the cause. Often these works are critically acclaimed. This is the image of Syrian filmmaker Walad Khatiyab, who made the 2019 film For Sama about the Syrian documentary and received a BAFTA for her film. However, they can also draw criticism. We'll be looking at For Sama and another film called The Square, a film that follows a group of Egyptian activists in the month of Egypt's first revolution to observe how revolutionary art specifically affects the international community. The criticisms for these films largely arise from the way they attempt to appeal to the Western world. For instance, the square has been accused of playing into the one-sided and often polemic portrayal of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Egyptian Revolution. The film's strategic elimination of certain parts of the Egyptian Revolution's timeline allow an unknowing viewer to perhaps believe that the Brotherhood did not sacrifice as much of their time or energy for the revolution and only joined to achieve power for themselves. For Sama faces criticisms for its use of violent imagery to articulate the crisis in Syria. The worry is that the constant onslaught of violence will turn the crisis into a spectacle, that it will nearly desensitize the viewer to the issue. Additionally, the issue of bodily autonomy is also a worry. It would be difficult for both filmmakers to ask permission of every person who appeared in the film for permission to use their image. On the other hand, proponents of maintaining the archive insist in its presence in the digital world and say that it can have a beneficial effect. The presence of the footage minimizes the risk of a repetition of the 1982 massacre in Hama, in which tens of thousands of Syrian citizens were killed, but lack of evidence allowed the Syrian government to easily cover up the tragedy. What's more, these works can bring international attention and provide unfiltered, unbiased footage, which is something that could not have been done in the past. So I would like to end on this incredible quote, which essentially summarizes the importance of art in a revolution. There are, of course, those who believe that the primary function of art should still be in its aesthetic value alone, but that seems to discredit the value which it can have, which we've broken down in these past few slides. It can become the epicenter of a revolutionary story. It can document the wins and losses along the way, and it can be a weapon against an oppressive government or a tool for recovery. In summary, art and literature are invaluable, both for the work they do for the revolutionaries and the stories they preserve for the generations after. Okay.
Thank you, Geetika, for that fascinating presentation. That was so enlightening. So we do have a couple of questions for you, and I will begin with the first one. So where do memorials fall in this space? Are they considered art or are they considered something else, especially for those who have perished during these attempted revolutions?
I think that it kind of depends on the way that they are sent out into the world. For example, sometimes a memorial can be in the form of a book dedicated to someone. That is a form of art. Whereas if it's something like the 9/11 memorial, which is like a fountain with the names of everyone who passed away or the first responders, that's more of a just a testament to all the people who have passed away. So it kind of depends on how they interact with the world and how they are created.
Understood. And so for the specific art pieces that you studied, did the creators receive pushback or punishment from their governments? Were they imprisoned for their criticisms?
Okay, this is actually a great question, and I really like it. So for the documentaries that I mentioned, actually the Syrian filmmaker had to escape from Syria after the documentary was made. And in fact, Wad al-Khatib is not even her actual name, because if she says her actual name, then her family is in danger. So definitely in the modern day, these artists are in danger of their government. They've not been imprisoned, but they are in danger.
Wow, fascinating. And so when you were talking about the pros and cons of sharing international footage or footage with international audiences, I wonder what your opinion is on that. Do you think it's a positive thing, or do you think there are more issues with it than not?
Well, of course, I kind of hesitate to give my own opinion because I come from a very privileged place and where I cannot exactly I can't even fully imagine what it must be like to undergo such awful things. But to be honest, I do think that the benefit to sharing these pieces outweighs the harm, because with issues like the Syrian revolution, the Egyptian revolution, the things that they're protesting are so awful and heartbreaking, and the governments are so powerful that they can easily silence the protesters. Whereas when you have something as direct, as easy to show the world as a film that you can post to YouTube or share on Amazon, it becomes so much easier to spread that message and kind of erase the possibility of these people's voices being lost.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. So I am going to now close us out. This was our last presenter of the session today. So thank you everybody so much for coming, for the presenters, for your hard work on your projects, and a huge thank you to all of the audience members for coming to support these students' presentations. We at Polygence are so incredibly proud of all of your achievements, and we're so glad that we got to cheer you on and celebrate you today on this stage. We encourage you to attend the other sessions today and get a sense of what some other Polygence students have been working on. And so you can simply navigate back to the reception area and click into any session you would like. But thank you so much again for joining us today, and congratulations on your achievements.